Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and right next to me is my lovely co-host, the Chattering Teacup.
Hello.
It's me being dramatic again, dear listeners. Don't mind me at all. And here with us from neighboring Italy, Kimberly Sullivan. Hello, Kimberly, and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Hello, Edith and Teacup. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for making time for us. It's a pleasure to have a neighbor on our show. We had neighbors from Switzerland and now we have neighbors from Italy. Wonderful. And you are also an expat because our neighbors in Switzerland, they come from the United Kingdom, Luis and Linda. And you are from the United States yourself.
Exactly.
And tell us, what brought you to Italy?
Yes, well, I've been in Italy for 25 years. So it definitely feels like home at this point. I came to Italy to do my master's degree, and my husband is Italian. Mm-hmm. So after my master's degree, I started working in Italy. I work in international development and stayed for many years, so a quarter of a century there. And in my free time, I write fiction. So it's a beautiful place to live. I cannot say that I have had a hard time adjusting to life in Italy. It's been pretty nice.
And good food too, don't they?
Not bad, I must say. A little bit spoiled there. Good food, good wine, beautiful art.
Beautiful people.
Very friendly and outgoing, and definitely know how to have a good time in life, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. The Italians know how to live, don't they?
I think the Austrians do too, for my short time there. But I think, I think the Italians as well. It's not bad. I'm not complaining.
Well, of course not.
Yeah. Talk a bit more about it, and I'll have to book a trip.
Yeah,
come down. We have our next conversation in Rome,
in person. Yeah, would be lovely. I mean, you said the Austrians know how to live here, but we are a bit more grumpy than the Italians.
Well, I've lived in Germany and was then Czechoslovakia, Prague, with now, of course, Czech Republic. And I always considered Austria in between Germany. And so you're more organized, my impression. You're much more organized than the Italians. And since I'm from New York, that's also a good thing. But you know how to have fun too. That's a positive.
Yes, as for the organization, I mean, there's always room to improve.
Improvement.
Yeah.
In Italy, there's lots of room to improve, but we have the sunshine.
Yeah, indeed.
It makes life interesting.
Yeah, indeed.
Absolutely.
Your books, Kimberly, you said in your free time you write books. And there are 3 books out now, 3 Coins and Dark Blue Waves and In the Shadow of the Apennines. The first one came out in 2021 and the other 2 came out last year.
Yes.
3 Coins is, as far as I gathered, a book about 3 expats who meet in Rome and during a screening of the film 3 Coins in the Fountain. Was that also the inspiration for this book?
Yes, it was. It's a 1954 big Hollywood production film, for those who might not know it, called 3 Coins in the Fountain. And it's actually, I find it fascinating because, of course, it's a typical Hollywood romance at the time. However, I mean, there were these 3 American women moving over to Rome, which would have been a big deal then, the idea. They were working as secretaries, and you don't know where, but that would have been during the Marshall Plan. So, of course, there were a lot of American, departments that were opening up with the Marshall Plan and the development. So I like this idea. And when you watch the film, of course, for many aspects, of course, it looks very dated. But I like the idea of a modern retelling with 3 women who come together and making their lives in Rome. And in fact, in the novel, they reflect on this a lot, what has changed and what hasn't changed. And so, yes, they're 3 very different women who might not have gotten to know one another and become friends otherwise, but they're kind of thrown together because they're at a sea resort place out of season, and they meet over this film, and so it kind of sets up their time together. So it was a lot of fun for me to be able to do it, and I think 3 Coins is a fun film to use as the starting off point. And people have impressions of Rome and how I speak as someone who loves it, but of course not everything is as wonderful as the the postcards and the films that you see. So they reflect on this as well.
Regarding impressions from the movie, I had the impression that the Fontana di Trevi is on a large square or something like that. And when I went there, I was astonished to see it's just three streets coming together. So it's quite a small place. It was very surprising. And the second book, Dark Blue Waves, I don't know if there was an inspiration there, but some years ago I saw the TV show Lost in Austen, and it kind of reminded me the idea.
Lost in Austen is the one where it's Austen land, where they.
I think the book is Austen land. Yeah.
Yeah, I have seen that with that. Well, I love the idea of time travel, and obviously I'm a huge Jane Austen fan. So for me, the inspiration for that was that I went to Bath with, I have two sons and they were very young at the time. And yeah, it was a little bit hard to take them on a Jane Austen walking tour, although I had done all of these things for them during this solo trip when I took them to London and we went all around and dinosaurs and lots of science museums. And then I said, we're going on the Jane Austen tour. I don't care. It's an hour and a half. I'm doing one thing. And so, of course, as any good mother, I told a little lie. And I said that Jane Austen wrote these adventure stories with dragons and knights and everything. And that didn't last very long, but I got my tour. And when I was there, of course, if you've been to Bath, you know, I mean, you can see how you feel like you're back in time. If you can block out the cars, it just is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. So this idea of a young woman who has studied English literature, I like that idea that she goes, and of course the Crescent is an absolutely beautiful building. And I thought, oh, wouldn't that be lovely if someone who knows about Jane Austen and thinks that she should know things. But then, of course, when you're confronted with reality, when she does actually travel back in time, she's getting in a bit of trouble too sometimes.
We were in Bath actually 2 times, weren't we? Yeah. And we went on a walk, not on a Jane Austen walk, but on a hiking walk, sort of. And we took a lot of pictures, and we will go back. We have to go back, like you said.
Gorgeous.
You have to.
And it was also very interesting at the Royal Crescent. There's I think
museum.
It's the first house or so in the Crescent. They turned it into a museum, and it was very interesting to visit it because they arranged everything in there like it was maybe 17 something, and you could walk around there, and the
in every room there was a
person there you could ask questions, and they were very. They knew a lot about the time, and so it was very interesting. Yeah, and then the dishes, the tables were covered with food, more or less, so like desserts and so on. Yeah.
Oh my goodness!
A dinner party at the Crescent, and what that entailed, and how that worked, and it was interesting.
This thing that's told about pineapples.
Because
pineapples back then were very expensive. Yeah. And so often people, they rented a pineapple to put on the table, and then they gave it back. Probably after some time they weren't really fit to eat, but they rented them just to show they could afford them. And I wondered what would happen if somebody said, I want to eat that.
Would have been very expensive then. Yeah. More expensive.
Sure. But even tea and things that was very expensive, and they would reuse it and everything, because when you look at trade today, of course, for us, it's not that. But these shiploads that had to come over with things, and how expensive things would have been coming from other parts of the world. It's incredible. Just the history of trade is fascinating.
And as we're talking about tea, back then,
the tea
a personal interest there.
Back then, when tea came first to Europe, actually the tea was quite old and not fresh anymore, because it took quite long to get there. And when it came to Europe, it wasn't quite fresh, and from Europe it went on to the United States, so it was a bit older back then. So it's
and we have a bit of history. I actually grew up in Boston, so also we know something about throwing the tea over.
Yeah, and I think this year there's an anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. Is it 150 years?
It's 74. So it's going to be this.
So they're doing something over the year.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about this book, this Dark Blue Waves. I mean, what I found most amusing have to admit, was the part where your character, Janet, meets her, how shall we put it, or how shall I put it, her adversary in 1813. I mean, the supposedly fiance of her hero, and the banter, or shall we say bitch slapping, the verbal one, was rather funny and amusing.
Miss Chadwick.
Yes, Miss Chadwick.
Yes, well, yes, she have to, as you know, with all Jane Austen books, of course, they have, everyone who knows Jane Austen sees the types that are there. So, of course, there's always a female antagonist as well, and often males who might not be what they appear. So they might seem a certain way, and then of course that always comes in. And actually, I did slip that in because it is true. If you read a lot of Jane Austen, you would think that the protagonist would finally, if you study it, you would know these things, right? You would know that perhaps the male is not exactly as he appears, and maybe he's the other character. But no, I had fun writing the character and how she reacts with Miss Chadwick, and particularly because she becomes such good friends with Emma Huntington. And at the time, right, you would have been pushed into a marriage that would have been convenient. I mean, adjoining estates, I think, is very difficult for people to say no to. So I think that in that case, Janet is very modern and is looking at things that way and doesn't quite understand why her friend Emma would be pushed into a marriage that is not a love match, but of course how few would have been.
But Emma and also her admirer, they are both very aware of the restraints of the time and of their classes. So they have no illusions what is going to happen to them, unlike Janet. I mean, Janet looks at, like you said, Janet looks at this whole relationship thing from her 21st century background. Of course she does. I mean, it's natural. But they are very realistic about what's going to happen and why it has to happen.
And I think that is part of the time, and even these things about entailments, right? I mean, I always find this fascinating. The entailments are if you didn't have sons, right? If you had only daughters, you knew that the money from your estate would go to perhaps some distant relative, perhaps it was a second cousin or something, but he was the male heir. So, they would know that they would have to marry well. And this is often an interesting discussion in Jane Austen's work. Obviously, this is one of the things that makes it so fascinating. And I did like looking at that from the fact that, again, that's why I wanted the protagonist, I wanted Janet to understand the time, but still find it difficult, even with that intellectual understanding of being there when she was really in the middle of it and understanding how that was. So, yes, I mean, she is obviously looking at a lot of things from that perspective. I also personally, I love history. And I wanted her, because I could understand that. I mean, the War of 1812 too, I studied, but how long does it go? You forget these things. So I have her in difficult situations, afraid to say something because she might be, thinking that it happens then and it hasn't yet happened. So I can see how certain things, particularly European history, is so complex and so many things happening that she's trying to think, are we allies? Are we enemies now? Has the war ended? So, certain things like this that I think that a modern day woman or anyone going back in time, you probably would be worried that you're going to get yourself into trouble with what you're saying, particularly about politics or things that are happening at the time.
Yeah. Also, like what happened in the book with illnesses.
Yeah.
When she had to, or she didn't have to, but she did care for the tenants' children and help them get better again with the measles, or the question of vaccination. I mean, for us, it's there. We don't think about it, but back then it was a complete foreign concept.
This is the thing that I think that people forget a lot. I mean, we even even today in the world, I mean, I work actually in development. So I work with in a lot of countries in Africa and in Asia. And unfortunately, child deaths are still a very serious problem in many places. And certainly at that time, the fact, first of all, that a child would be born alive would be amazing. Yeah. And then most children didn't live up until 5, unfortunately. So little things today. I mean, if your child is born with a different blood type, right, you're going to have the bilirubin levels, which are going to be very high. Today we have the jaundice. The baby will start to turn yellow. What do? You put it under the billy lights, right? And the baby is fine. Back then they died. A baby's born perfectly healthy, and 2 weeks later they died. Then, of course, it's based on historical fact, but obviously I fictionalize things. But, cholera did go through in around that areas and through London. So many people died from cholera. Measles was a terrible childhood disease that many children died from. And of course, one of the things is that she is a literature student, but her father is an architect and she has studied architecture. So she also has this interest in being able to have things that modern hygiene, which are normal to us, that people didn't have at the time. Fascinating also for me living in Rome. When you read about the, 19th century literature, I don't know if you've heard about the Roman fever, and people used to die of the Roman fever. I absolutely adore Edith Wharton, and I don't know if you know Henry James, Daisy Miller, which is a lovely story. It's very funny because it's an American, very brash, young, very attractive girl who comes to Rome and likes to get the attention of the men, and she goes walking out at night with a young Italian man, and then she catches Roman fever, and in the end, this causes her eventual death. But the thing is that the Roman fever was malaria. People used to think it was walking out at night in the cold air or, things like this. And they would always say the Roman fever, you can't. Well, yes, it was going out at night, but it was going out at night because of the mosquitoes. And this was all around Rome so, I mean, the things like this that were just, children died, or the measles would come in and they would say this, or cholera, or things like this that are, hygienic issues. Once they were able to get rid of the swampland around Rome, the Roman fever, the malaria, is obviously no longer an issue. So these are fascinating. Looking at it from our perspective, if you were able to go back in time, you could see these things.
Yeah, true. And as for the cholera in London, Teacup, that's your expertise with ES, because you always tell me that there was less of it, or it was less of a problem when people started drinking tea.
It was because people started, because when you're making tea, you start by boiling the water. And so there was hardly any safe water to drink, and then it was safe to drink. That's the main reason. But I think then they came, because tea was so expensive, they started mixing in all different types of things, and some, even the same was done with coffee, so maybe some of that got you ill on the other end. So and they drank less alcohol because of that.
The thing is, though, that that the alcohol is also because the water was not clean, so they would drink a lot of ale. And people would be drunk throughout the day a lot, because they would be drinking. In Italy, I mean, the history of Italy, of course, the water, people were drinking from the Tiber, the river, which is terrible. So we have aqueducts that actually from Roman time bringing in, but that was typical. People drank wine all day, largely because of the fact that the water was not hygienic. So clean water is important.
Oh, yes.
And people didn't have
it.
Yeah.
Still is, but in a lot of European countries at the time, this was a huge issue. So absolutely.
Yeah. And I also wanted to ask you about a little bit about Victoria Chadwick. I mean, you don't mention it in your book, but I was wondering what happened to her in the end. Could you tell us? Would you tell us?
Well, I would imagine she was a very, very attractive woman and very accomplished. So I hope that there was a little bit of sympathy in some way to her, even though I like writing. I like writing the antagonists. I like writing those types of characters. But in the end, I hope that Janet also realized that it's the time. I mean, particularly if you were a woman, you didn't have any other options. There wasn't, which Janet herself realizes many times. If she gets thrown out of this household, which she does fear, what does she do? I mean, what do you do in 1813 as a as a woman by yourself. She realizes that she won't be able to live or to make her living. So I think at one point, even though, let's say, they're antagonists, she does realize that it is important for her to secure a husband, and perhaps not for the right reasons. Perhaps it's not love, but Miss Chadwick wants her place in society, and she wants to secure it, and that was the thinking of the time.
There could be another book in there, couldn't there? I mean, come to think of it, I mean, like you said, I mean, Victoria is very keen on securing a husband, and she might marry up in society.
Perhaps.
Okay, yeah, sorry, but just
shall we co-author it?
Yeah, that's the thought. I mean, just think about it.
Do you think
she could go to the court in Vienna? That could be fascinating too.
See, yeah. Can't think of it. Yeah. Sorry, Teacup, go on.
Do you think a lot of this misunderstanding, and looking back at these times, comes from the fact that when we think about marriage, we think about love, whereas back then they thought about marriage to more or less be settled in life.
Exactly. And that is, I mean, as much as I love Jane Austen, I don't think you should read it specifically as love stories. I mean, we see it that way, I think, as a modern reader, but it's very much about family. It's very much about, being able to find these partnerships and everything. And I think that that's really important to look at as well. It's normal. I mean, the same way that whenever we go to a foreign country, of course, we love everything there and it's interesting, but we're always looking at it from our perspective. I'm very aware of that when you look at things, you're always thinking through your own perspective. So I like that idea of her going and looking at things through her modern perspective, even if she studies the time. And also that she reevaluates a lot of things as well. And, you look at things a little bit differently when you're actually living through it. I mean, of course, I do like that with Bath, since you know it so well. If you were wealthier, you lived up. Right? You didn't want to live down, because it's true that, with the coal and that would hang down on the city, the air wouldn't be very clean, right? And then the idea of course, having the horse manure on the streets. I mean, she notices that, or the cruelty in many ways. I mean, she's excited to be back, but life was very difficult, certainly, especially she sees the children who are working, right? Who are out in the fields working, or who are, she sees someone trampled, a washerwoman who's trampled by a horse. I mean, these are the types of things that, people were really working very hard, or even, the servants in the home where she is. I mean, when she has to get a bath drawn for her, of course, you have to lug all the water. These are the things that, yes, you read about it, but I think it's completely different if you had the possibility to travel back in time and see it for yourself.
And indoor plumbing is a must.
Yeah, and also the smells. If you read about it, you don't smell what it was back then. So it's completely different. I think also back then, there weren't that many options for women to earn a living.
No. Very, very few.
It's very limited.
Yes. No, I mean, you could be a governor. Even then, it still would have been a little bit, because that came a little bit later in the 1800s. But yes, I mean, but for someone from a better off family, you would have been decorative. You would have been, I mean, you certainly would have studied languages. You would have studied art, music, things like that. But you weren't necessarily even the person who would become the governesses or things like that. So yes, if something didn't work out, you really had to marry well.
Exactly. I mean, you were either married or you were the annoying spinster aunt.
Yeah, who would take care of maybe the other children of, maybe your sisters or things like that. Sure. And then you had absolutely, I mean, that was the only way to have a little bit of control over your life, because if you were married, then you at least maintained a household and you had a social status.
Yep, absolutely. And you mentioned before the importance of family and friends in Jane Austen's books. And my question would be, since there is a new discussion about warnings, and there is a warning now in Jane Austen's books, should Jane Austen come with a warning, do you think?
Or, no, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that last point.
There is a discussion in academia now, and they put, I don't know which university exactly, but the university in the UK put a warning into Northanger Abbey.
Content warning.
Content warning.
Should
Jane Austen, because of toxic relationships and friendships.
And stereotypes.
Exactly, and stereotypes. So should Jane Austen come with a warning?
And actually she's criticizing the way society was back then, and it's kind of ridiculous in my opinion.
But it's not. Well, you're not going to find this very, because I went through university at a different time, and I think I would find it very difficult to go through today, because I see especially the US and the UK are leading in craziness, which has not quite happened. Yes, of course we look at things in the past, but I do not like this concept. This was starting off because I studied undergraduate political science and history. Mm-hmm. And at that time, you could still have these interesting discussions with your professors. But from what I understand today, many students feel very upset about exactly they want warnings. Times were different. I don't want to, I mean, I don't know. I live in a country with millennia long history. And what should we do? Should we put content warnings on the Colosseum because people were being basically fed to the lions? I mean, there are things that are different in time. And I don't necessarily, and I think that actually I did want to say that a little bit in the book too. Hopefully it came out. But when she goes back, she also judges things differently. Yep. She is a character who goes back and is learning and is trying to learn and is trying to learn how things were and is trying to fit in. And that can be difficult, again, just because so many things have changed. But as you know from reading it, I mean, she has to decide whether or not she's going to stay or going back. But there's much that attracts her. I mean, she's not completely at home in the modern world either, right? So there are a lot of things that she finds good in that. And I did actually have a line in there where later on where, she says, not to judge us when she's talking about the past by the standards of today, but to look at it then.
I mean, like you said, you can't really judge the past with the eyes of the present. It simply, or it should not be done.
No.
And like you said, you should realize that people or society or politics looked at the world through a different lens, let's call it that. It's a very common phrase these days, but they did. They didn't share our values because they had different values back then.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that the easiest thing is, the role of women, as we say. I mean, the role of women 50 years ago or 100 years ago, this idea that we're supposed to say that 200 years ago or 100 years ago, people didn't think that women should work. No, of course, no one did. I mean, if they did, it was unusual. If we find, I mean, I have Mary Wollstonecraft in there. And in fact, one of the things is that Janet has to go back to understand because, I did a lot of political philosophy and I love it. But, you read Mary Wollstonecraft, if you're a woman today, it doesn't seem revolutionary at all, right? I mean, she only says that women should be educated to a certain level to be better mothers and to pass on to the children, which doesn't seem revolutionary. But of course, at the time it was. And that's why I think it's important to understand what was revolutionary at the time, how people thought at the time. And I'm not of the belief that everything from the past, I mean, only today are we so enlightened. And in the past, I mean, obviously, as you also saw that I had in the book, I mean, they sit around reading poetry. That is their, I mean, I'm sorry, but I think that's far more enlightened than much of our entertainment today. So I'm not of the belief, and I think that's many young people at the university. I'm sure that they will also, as they get older, change this as well. But no, this idea also that unfortunately in America too, that already we're quite bad with history and teaching history. And if we're going to start saying, no, you can't teach the great philosophers because they're dead white men, I don't want to listen to that. I mean, I'm sorry. And you can, it's also very easy to be able to say you can only teach modern scholars, but I'm not, I don't really believe in that. I enjoy the canon. I enjoy the ancient philosophers. I enjoy studying ancient Rome. I enjoy this. Yes, of course, it's fascinating to be able to look at it today and what has changed, what is it. But at the same point, I always think you have to get into the mindset of the time that you are. And I think that's also true of countries. Like as someone who's lived a lot abroad, if I always go in and say, oh my goodness, in America we do this, and in Austria you do it this way, or the Italians do this, but they should do it like that. That's insane. You can't do that. You're going to be unhappy. and you're not going to understand the culture.
Yeah. And
so you have to.
I mean, you always have to look at it in context of the time, but also especially regarding, for example, women. You don't have to go back in time. You just have to travel around the world. And there are completely different views of what women are allowed to do or should do. So this viewpoint that some activists are talking about is a very limited view regarding the population of the whole planet. Because in other countries, they would say they're crazy and they're not allowed to do that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I work mostly with countries that are not OECD countries, not developed countries. And so a lot of times what I see on a university campus is completely divorced from how the rest of the world works. And I don't want to say always, but oftentimes, the perhaps the people who are pushing this most are not the most worldly. They know their own little environment and they don't realize how it is in the rest of the world. And so, with these things, I do like to always understand the history at the time. I mean, when I go back, I don't always go back from, I mean, yes, here in this story, I had it from a modern perspective, but it was a modern perspective of a woman who does love 19th century literature and studies it and has a great knowledge about it. But even she finds it difficult to go back and really get 100% in the time and make sure that she is seen as a woman from the time and that, there aren't anachronisms in her behavior. But I think that we all benefit if we try to see how people thought at the time.
And your latest book, In the Shadow of the Apennines, you also combine the present with the past and also a little bit technology, which doesn't bode well for your character.
Yes. Well, yes, I think with these things, we know my modern character does get in trouble, getting kind of like thumbs up and likes and not realizing that was not a very smart move on her place. So she does get in trouble in her little village in a beautiful region of Italy, the Abruzzo region, the Apennines. And, but yes, it's another, it is a story definitely tying together the present and the past and a woman with many difficulties to overcome, who then gained strength from a woman in the past who led quite a difficult life but was very strong. And yes, leading up to World War I, which in the mountains of Italy in Abruzzo, with a big earthquake that they had there, which was devastating. And then of course World War I, there were so many losses of young men in that region because they were from the mountains and they were fighting in the Alps. Yes. So it was a tough region. It was a tough time for that region. And so she learns a lot. And it's another, actually, with what we were discussing, she is quite an educated, quite a perceptive woman, but goes in there a little bit with a certain mentality and does not fully understand where she's going. And so, and does not understand the culture around her. And perhaps for that reason, she is not as understanding and as generous as she should have been to people who are welcoming her to the community. And she learns that from the history, from a connection that she feels with diaries that she finds from a woman who's from that town. And from that, she gets to know the region. So I think that's important too.
Yeah. And isn't it a kind of prejudice that's always around, that people living in small villages are a bit backwards? And that's why maybe she's kind of okay with ridiculing them?
Well, I think that the protagonist in my novel, she's escaping her life in America because she's gone through a difficult divorce and she's lost her university job, so she wants a fresh start. And perhaps in America we have a lot of these kind of films or things that people then start off someplace new and they're very, very happy and everything is wonderful. Maybe she sees that as what's going to happen, but it is a little bit hard, not because they're backwards or this, but it is hard to, if you're going to move and you decide to go to a little mountain town, it is a little bit, you're making it more difficult on yourself. In the end, it winds up being positive for her, but perhaps she was a bit naive and thinking it would have been so easy. You're also coming with the same problems, right? They're still going to follow you if you go someplace else unless you work this through.
Absolutely. And also, my question would be, now that we have included all your books in this conversation, would you say that there is a common thread in your books?
I think with all of the books. I write under the umbrella, let's say, of women's fiction. So I write contemporary, I write historical and dual timeline. And the next that I have coming out are short stories. So I have a collection of short stories. But women's fiction, the common thread is really the individual journey. I mean, of course, there's the plot and everything around it, but really the most important thing is seeing the interior journey of the protagonist. So all of my novels certainly have that. I think that I'm very interested in identity. I do, because I'm also, let's say, an American who's living abroad. I do like this idea of when you have someone in an environment that they didn't grow up in. They do look at this a little bit different. You can see certain things about how you fit in, what you need to learn about yourself, what you need to learn about the context around you, because often it's not a language that's not yours or not a culture that's not yours. So I think that a lot of that, it does come out. I think female friendship also comes out a lot, and the connection between women, and also this idea of learning from the past. You know, certainly with the history in a lot of this does come out about how they can learn from the women who came before them.
And how, if at all, would you say, has your being an American in Europe influenced your perspective, changed your perspective as a writer?
Oh, I think a lot, just because I mean, I absolutely love Europe, but you have, I mean, I love America too, but you have so much culture and so much history. And for me, I find it fascinating. I mean, especially living where I'm living in Italy, everything is so interesting to me. So I personally also want to explore this, like with Abruzzo. It's a region, which is where my third novel is set, in the shadow of the Apennines. It's a region I love. And I do have we have a little place out there, and we go hiking and really like it. And I wanted to discover more about it because of the 2009 L'Aquila earthquake. That's when I learned about the Pescina earthquake, which I cover in this book. And that was because I was fascinated by it. And I went to this town of Pescina, which is in the novel. And it was a town that was devastated. I mean, 80% of the people in the town died in the earthquake. And if you go there today, the town is still, it was over 100 years ago, but it's still like that. I mean, they've rebuilt some of the houses, but some of them are just in ruins. And so when you walk around it today, I'm fascinated by that. And I wanted to have that. And I thought that this would be something that an American woman who had come over and had not really understood the society in which she was living, to understand the difficult life, really terribly difficult life, and the poverty of the time, and what a young girl had to go through to be able to survive after something like that. She could internalize that and become stronger herself, which is something that she needs with all of the things that she's facing. So yeah, I think that definitely, I'm looking at it from a certain perspective, perhaps, that I enjoy. And then there are just so many interesting things to explore that it's fun for me.
Are books dead?
No. I really dislike that I had that, as you know, in there, because that was Steve Jobs who said that, by the way. He said books are dead, which is ironic, because I will bring the fact that, like many people in Silicon Valley who push all of this technology on us, they mostly send their kids to schools that are very
not technological,
old school.
Advanced.
Yeah, no technology, I know. The classics, the ancient philosophers that we were speaking about. Yeah. And that becomes a real issue. So
yeah, that's because they know best how dangerous it can be to involve yourself too much in digital things.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. But people are reading less than they did in the past. Absolutely. I mean, there is that. But however, I don't know, with things like NetGalley and people who love books and speaking about books and building a book community, as both of you know very well, podcasts about books. These are things that, are attracting a large portion of readers that we didn't have in the past. So I'm optimistic, but of course I would be, because like you, I love books. But no, I think you need to maintain books.
I think it maybe is changing the way we consume books, but books such as the way of telling stories, and storytelling has always been around in one way or another. I guess it will always be around.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, I agree.
I think the stories won't die.
No,
just maybe a different form of transporting it.
I think so too. And since you are a free time writer, it sounds awful. Sorry for that. You write in your free time. You have
Yes.
you have a so-called day job, and you also write. I mean, what is the most challenging part in doing so?
It is. The good thing is that I write pretty quickly. So that I found to be very positive. So, and when I have time, then I really spend my time doing that. So I enjoy writing. It's just something, I mean, I write a lot for my regular work, but it's much more diplomatic and it's much more careful and things like that. So when I can just make up worlds of my own, it's such a treat that it's a lot of fun. I have great writing communities. So, I have a writing group with whom I work, and I'm in the Women's Fictions Writers Association and the Historical Novels Society, and they have conferences and they bring people together. Particularly with the technology today, it's great because we have craft classes, we have authors come to speak, we discuss certain issues. So there are a lot of possibilities, let's say, for authors today that even a few years ago you didn't have, and that's lovely. So those things help a lot. But no, I mean, for me, it's just such a pleasure to write. I enjoy it. Yes, I don't have as much time, let's say, as I might be able to otherwise, but I make the most of it.
And are you constantly putting down ideas? Do you have a notebook next to your bed? Yeah.
I do. Yeah, I always have. I mean, at least I have. Yeah, I'm not so worried about not having ideas. The problem is making sure that they come to fruition. But no, I have a lot of ideas of things that I'd like to do. And I love historical research because I did study history and I like going to the archives. And here in Italy, I love going and seeing the old newspapers. They have the wonderful, I go to do some research in the Library of the Senate here, where they have the old newspapers and you can just go through them and they let you touch them too. It's just so wonderful. So I love things like that.
And since you said you write very fast, do you plan a lot then, or do you just go with the flow?
I'm a terrible pantser, and I did try to. Let's say many people say that you should fix that and you should plot, and I have tried to do it, but I'm just not. I'm not a plotter, and I think it's very hard if something is working. It's very hard to try to reconstruct something that then doesn't feel natural. So no, I do a lot of research, so I have the idea of the world that I want to build and everything, but I have to know my characters by writing. It just doesn't work for me doing, and that's not saying it's probably much better to be to be a plotter, but it's not my natural state. And I remember once I felt very freed once I read an interview with an Irish author who is wonderful with kind of, I don't know if you know Tana French. She is Irish and she's written a lot of kind of police thriller, psychological thrillers, which are very, I mean, for me, I always thought that those were always plotters. I thought you had to plot this. And she said, no, I never plot my books because if I know who did it, then everyone else will know. I have to discover it. So I said, well, if she's doing it, if she's a pantser, then...
What we have discovered talking to crime fiction authors and listening to them is there's also a mix. Some of them are plotters, some of them are pantsers, some are in between, and
everyone does it a bit differently, and it's fine.
I would say there is no correct way of writing a book, is there?
Only if you to finish it.
I think finishing it is the most important, and then getting beta reader. I always work with a lot of people to be beta readers. I have a very good editor with whom I work, and then a proofreader because you never see your own when you go through. So having good people who help you along the way, but the important thing is getting it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kimberly, what would be your advice for any other author or aspiring author out there who wants to get his or her book out?
Well, I'm still fairly new on this journey, so I'm not sure that my advice is worth so much. However, what I do think that is most important is finding your group of authors who write in your genre, because authors are incredibly generous with their time, with their knowledge. They really want other people to succeed. I mean, I'm an indie author, so I mean, particularly in that community, you know, people are really want to see what works, what doesn't work, and help you out. So, I mean, for me, my membership in the Women's Fiction Writers Association and Historical Novel Society is fabulous, because you can talk to people, you can bounce ideas off of them. That's where, you know, you have good writing groups in genres that, you know, you're working in. Because obviously, if you're a mystery writer, you should be involved in groups with other mystery writers because they know this. So I think that writers groups are fantastic.
And what are your plans for the future? I mean, you said there is a collection of short stories coming out, but what else do you have planned?
Yeah, so in May, I love short stories. So I'm very excited about short stories. Don't necessarily sell very well today, but there have to be advantages to being an indie author anyway. If 5 people read it, I'm going to be happy because I love short stories. And in fact, when I was living in Austria, when I was living in Prague, I start in a language reading short stories because it's a lot easier to do than novels. So I'm a big fan of short stories. However, so I have short stories that are set largely in Italy, either or Italian women abroad. So there is the tie for that. And then after that, I've already completed, and I'm working now with my editor on a historical contemporary that's set in Rome today and in the 1890s, which is fascinating time as well in Rome, when surprisingly Italy was still a fairly new country, which seems odd to us, but you know, the Risorgimento Italy was still quite young in the 1890s, and it was fascinating time. And then I have others that I'm researching now that also are set in Italy.
Which will also bring a lot, I suppose, I don't know, but which will also bring a lot of the Roman Catholic Church in the book?
Not in it. The story is very specific with the one that I have in the 1890s. So not so much for that. I am working on one which will be fascist era Italy. So I'm doing all the research now, which is fascinating with the newspapers where Mussolini was the director of the newspaper. So I'm going through all of the newspapers at the time. Catholicism does come in, obviously, because in Italy, but it's not, so far it hasn't been major.
They held a lot of power. Do they still hold a lot of power in your experience now?
Well, not to the same extent in the past, but yes, sure. The church is very important for a lot of things, also for politics and in Italy, absolutely.
Yeah. And the short story collections, will it be contemporary, historical, or both?
Those are contemporary. Yeah, I would love to do one with historical. I'm now working with some fellow writers to maybe do an anthology that would be historical, but these are all contemporary.
Well, a lot to look forward to then. Oh, good. So, Kimberly, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know? Anything else you would like to share?
Just that I am a travelaholic. I love travel in general. And whenever I go someplace, I like to think about what it would be like to live in a place like that. And I have to say, your capital city, where you are coming from and podcasting from, is really one of my favorite cities in Europe, because it is just, I love classical music. So there I was spoiled. I think the Austrians are very, very friendly. It's a small city where it's easy to get around, right? So it's not it's very gemütlich. I really, really like Austria a lot. So I hope that in the future you will invite me back when I am in Austria and we can have a glass of wine together, or when you come to Rome and we can do it that way.
Absolutely. It would be absolutely lovely.
Very good idea.
May I warn you, dear listeners, we are friendly, but we are a bit grumpy. Which doesn't mean we are not friendly. We are friendly. We're just grumpy. We're not unfriendly. As some people say. No,
just don't understand us.
Yes, we're just grumpy. But otherwise, we are quite nice.
Absolutely.
So, Kimberly, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely a pleasure for me. Thank you so much. And wonderful thing to do before I go back to Rome. So thank you for inviting me while I was here and visiting in Padova.
It was great having you on the show. Thank you. You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.